Добро пожаловать! Welcome! This is part 2 of a video series about a Cold War going hot in 1989, pitting NATO Pact against Warsaw Pact. This time we will be dealing with the balance of power in the air. Please refer to part 1 for general outlines of the whole scenario and a list of possible allies. Scenario assumes no nukes and sudden start of hostilities with no time for preparation. Germany would have been the main battlefield with greatest concentration of troops and aircraft. Various air missions would commence literally within an hour. Besides the greater number of planes stationed, Soviet pressure on NATO air bases would be aided by greater number of ready and in-range missiles. Soviet side could fire perhaps an order of magnitude more missiles right away. It would create serious problems for NATO sortie raids in Germany and could outright destroy some of its planes. Especially the Tochka missile would be quite deadly with its precision guidance. NATO would eventually retaliate with a cruise missile barrage, but many of the naval launch platforms would take days or weeks to position. Bomber aircraft only carried nuclear-tipped missiles. Soviet side would also use bomber-launched long-range ballistic missiles. Movement of the front line on the ground could also have a serious effect, though more about that in next video. Due to many temporarily shut down air bases and suppressed air defenses, the balance of numbers would be even more skewed than initial plane numbers shown. Soviets would be favored and on the initiative, but the battlefield of West Europe is quite small, and a much larger number of planes would quickly join the fight, launching from their bases safe from missile harassment or frontline movement. NATO's jet fighter numbers would roughly equal the Warsaw Pact in that regard. But the range of various aircraft would become strained, with distances differently influencing each side. NATO planes were designed for slightly different requirements and were on the average larger. They were designed to carry more fuel and their engines were on average more advanced, using less fuel. It all means plane ranges are noticeably different for the two sides. Of course, actual unrefueled combat radius is shorter, but the difference is still enough to protect a good deal of NATO air bases from Soviet strikes, while enabling NATO strikes on the bases across the front line or in East Germany. Further range for NATO fighters would be added by aerial refueling. It is one area where NATO had a massive advantage, due to different requirements and doctrine. US planes were designed so they could deploy over the Atlantic to Europe as quickly as possible. Also, threat of Soviet ground advance meant that their planes needed range to strike from afar. Both of those needs were met by a huge air tanker fleet. When one looks at composition of Soviet fighter jets that could receive fuel in air, it becomes clear the doctrine was different. NATO used tankers to fuel their tactical jets as much as their bombers. Soviets mostly used tankers for bombers. Very few of their tactical planes could refuel in air. Besides getting planes from the US to Europe, tankers could enable aircraft to remain on station in the air for longer than Soviet planes. Both sides had far larger combat jet inventories than just what the Europe would initially hold, better part of which would be rebased closer to European front over the next few days and weeks. As one can see, while NATO fleet is more equally divided between US and Europe, both in numbers and quality, non-Soviet Warsaw Pact states comprise a smaller number of total Pact planes, and their planes are a bit older as well. But overall total is on Warsaw Pact side. Neither US nor Soviet Union would actually use all of their planes in Europe. Protection of homelands from bomber strikes would be needed, as well as participation on the Pacific front. US Navy and Marines would send part of their fighters to land bases in Europe. Carriers themselves would take longer to travel. Importantly, no carrier can be deployed indefinitely, so over a long 6-month period, roughly half of the US carriers could actually be deployed to sea at any one time. Soviets had to protect their vast homeland from bomber strikes, tying up some planes. Pacific theater would be quite important as well, as Soviets would not want to lose access to the Pacific Ocean. Japan, while technically not in NATO, signed a defense treaty with the US and would side with it. Soviet Union would find itself initially outnumbered in the Pacific. It would also be faced with considerable US Marine Corps assets, as 60% of US Marines were stationed in the Pacific. Those forces would try and take key bases on Kamchatka or even Sakhalin. Not wanting to lose them nor lose its Pacific fleet, Soviet Union would divert some of its fighters to the Pacific, leaving less for Europe. Those would likely be air defense branch interceptors. Interesting thing about Soviet air defenses was that they were a completely separate branch, not part of the army nor air force. They were tasked to protect key areas around Soviet Union. They were not meant to aid much in offensive operations beyond Soviet borders. And they controlled most of the long-range ground-to-air missiles, as well as many fighters and interceptors. Soviet Union's sprawling border was more exposed to bomber and missile incursions over the North Pole. It had several times more area to protect, as well as protect the Pacific bases and Moscow, fairly close to the front. So Soviets would have kept most of their air defense fighters inside Soviet Union's borders. Mainland US was a smaller area to protect. Also, the threat of Soviet bomber raids was smaller as Soviets lacked tankers in numbers and conventional cruise missiles. European countries, being fairly close to the front line, had fighters which could both serve as interceptors and aid as fighter escort in offensive ops, if opportunity arises. With some Soviet planes protecting their motherland, total balance of tactical combat planes in Europe would still favor the Warsaw Pact, though the difference would not be as big. To achieve such numbers, though, several weeks would have to pass, during which initial air forces would get attrited to a degree, and during which the front line may move. If it moves towards the west, it would mean less air bases for NATO. At the same time, it would mean less distance to cross for NATO planes to the front and greater distances for Soviet planes. But a lot of Soviet planes were designed to be operated from fairly improvised air bases to a greater degree than their NATO counterparts. Also, some of the NATO planes would really be tied in the Atlantic, protecting the transport routes instead of skies over European lands. One segment where Soviets were far ahead was number of surface-to-air systems. They accentuated air defenses so much they created a whole organizational branch for it. European countries usually gave their longer-range SAM systems to their air forces and the smaller mobile ones to their armies. US gave all of their SAM systems to their army, being aware of the need to protect its ground troops. As one can see, difference in numbers is staggering. Another doctrinal difference explaining it was the fact Soviets had a much larger territory to be covered, as well as Soviet philosophy of not throwing away old weapons. While US preferred to invest funds in older systems to make them more modern and retire near obsolete systems completely, Soviets preferred investing in upkeeping the numbers, even if that meant a lot of their systems being near obsolete. Mobility is another key difference in philosophy. A lot of Soviet older systems are lacking in mobility, as they are meant to protect fixed sites all over the Warsaw Pact. On the other hand, Soviets also had custom-designed long-range SAMs for the army, which were quite mobile, so they could travel with the frontline troops if needed. Soviets also accentuated the need for range of their SAMs. While maximum ranges depicted would rarely if ever be useful against fighter jets, they could be a threat to slower planes, such as bombers, tankers, or various sensor aircraft. It was a way to keep those types at bay. Both sides employed anti-radar platforms quite a bit, though again with some differences. Soviets accentuated very long-range missiles against nearly fixed targets such as early warning radars. NATO concentrated more on tactical-sized missiles against SAM batteries. Both sides used jammers and decoys, with Soviets using larger planes and missile-converted decoys, while NATO preferred the numbers and went for smaller-sized ones, launched by fighter-sized aircraft. NATO fleet would have likely positioned some of their assets, carrier and air defense ships, near the European shores to aid in the air war. But even if NATO managed to add a few dozen air defense ships to key areas, overall numerical balance in terms of SAM systems would not change much. Shorter-ranged SAM systems were used mostly for protection of army units in the field by both sides. Most of the systems were pretty mobile. Soviets again accentuated tracked systems, which could match pace with moving army units. As one can see, Soviets again enjoyed a very large numerical advantage. Missile systems are, perhaps more than other weapons, very sensitive when it comes to technology. A radar and missile a decade older than the target may mean kill chance will drop to just several percent. A system on par with the target plane tech may push that to over 10%. Soviet long-range systems lagged behind in technology on average, somewhat halving their effectiveness compared to NATO's. But their short-range systems were kept pretty modern. All that basically means that NATO aircraft would have not regularly afforded to go past the front line. Losses would have been unsustainable. If NATO planes would have operated just at the front line, losses would still be high. Only sustainable options for NATO air forces over the European land would be to protect its airspace and participate in counterattacks on advancing Soviet troops, which would somewhat lack in overall SAM protection. The reason why Soviets invested more in their SAMs than fighters compared to NATO was again one of doctrine, which stemmed from technology. NATO systems were on average more advanced. Radars and engines of similar weight class were a decade more modern, and secret technology was 5 to 10 years more modern. In the end, NATO was more reliant on their air forces to deliver ground fire support with precision weaponry. Also, it relied more on long-range air combat. Conversely, Soviets chose to use more artillery and tanks to provide that extra firepower and optimize their fighter jets for close combat. A neutral area air battle would thus have NATO planes firing first and thinning out Soviet numbers, but at shorter distances, Soviet accent on maneuverability of both planes and missiles meant they could level the playing field to a degree. Of course, there would hardly be a neutral area. Air combat would mostly happen with one side having decisive numerical or technological edge, as it chooses whether to intercept the enemy or not. Soviets used single-role planes, NATO used some multi-role planes. In effect, that allowed NATO to pump up their fighter numbers when needed, at the expense of strike-configured planes. And then later, those planes could be configured for strike if fighter threat wasn't as grave anymore. Average quality of jets was on NATO side, as Soviets again preferred to invest in keeping the old types in operation and keeping the numbers high. Special mission planes such as AWACS and other sensor platforms were, due to technology edge, somewhat on NATO side, but not decisively so. Combat training of pilots was more accentuated in the West. NATO pilots trained more, though one couldn't say they were trained twice as well. Soviet pilots mostly trained for one role, while a part of NATO pilots had to train for a wider range of roles. Missile technology was an area where NATO held some edge, though Soviet missiles of the 1980s started to close that gap. One also has to keep in mind the size of the battlefield. When talking about the Soviet Pacific coast, Soviets would have to use more planes to cover all those distant areas. Farther bases such as ones on Kamchatka would have more issues defending due to their very remote nature and poor connectivity to rest of the Soviet Union. The European front would be so small that there would be literally hundreds of planes in the air at either side at any one time. While the numbers previously cited could allow for 1,000 combat planes in the air on each side, there is actually not enough room or communication and control capacity on the European battlefield to have 1,000 planes coordinate at once. With hundreds of planes in the air, it would be hard to tell who is tracking which target. Even though fighter jets back then could theoretically see out to over 100 kilometers, useful performance was more limited. Not many targets could be tracked. Actual identification of targets was very hard beyond several dozen kilometers, and ranges against low-flying targets were poor. Ultimately, fairly small numbers of planes would be used per mission, and thus the Soviet numerical advantage would be strategic, not tactical. Actual air battles would involve similar number of planes, but Soviets would have a larger inventory of planes to replace their losses. In the end, they would need them, as NATO could enjoy better kill ratios in the air. But no side could hope to truly control the airspace over the other side's territory. NATO might have some edge over the front line as long as the front line is slowly moving towards west and out of reach of most of Soviet air defenses. Controlling it while pushing into Warsaw Pact would have been impossible. And neither side could control the airspace over the front if the front was static. In a prolonged, year-long war, NATO might have a chance of eventually forcing Soviets to spend all their numbers and establish some semblance of superiority. But such a long war would have been unlikely. Ultimately, balance of power in the air was marginally on NATO's side. But we didn't look into Warsaw Pact's land might yet. Whether it would offer any such opportunity or if the ground war would be concluded in mere months.